This is Building Up, brought to you by Watt, Teeter, Hoffer and Fitzgerald and the Vertex companies, where you get insights from industry experts, reviewing topics construction professionals deal with on a daily basis, observations on new developments within the industry, and practical guidance from Vertex's experts and the attorneys at Watt, Teeter to help your business thrive in the construction industry.
Welcome to Building Up. I'm Jeff Katz with Vertex, here with Brian Padove of Watt Teeter, and this is Building Up, the podcast for construction professionals, and we are here on episode number 1.
We're excited to bring this podcast to you. Again, as Jeff said, this is the first episode of what we hope to be a long-running podcast for construction professionals, giving them really this informal way to learn about general construction topics that they kind of deal with on a daily basis. You know, we've been to all of these different types of CLEs, association events, all that stuff. And really what we see is, yeah, you have the teacher who's teaching the audience, but it's not a conversational type of practice. And, you know, the person who's listening is only getting a general knowledge of whatever topic is being presented. And what we really want to do is provide a informal way for you, the audience, to really learn about these, what we believe are interesting topics in the construction industry, and kind of learn how you can utilize these topics or insights into your business.
And I've already locked in my 10-year deal for this podcast, so I think this is going to have, an excellent run. And what I think it's going to be great how we're going to engage some really interesting guests. We're going to bring people in from all sides of the construction industry. People who are, professors and academics, people who are, attorneys who've been practicing for long careers, expert witnesses, and then people who are, out there running construction companies, running subcontractors, owners, developers. I mean, we really want to engage all the different parties so we can get a full look at what we're dealing with and what should we be looking for, and kind of hopefully answering some questions that we've had along the way and others have along the way, and maybe some ones that people haven't answered before.
Yeah, I think it's really just giving that practical guidance to professionals that they really don't get anywhere else. So I think that that's really the goal of this podcast. And I think our first episode today is, hopefully a good standard for the rest of the podcasts to come. We have 2 really great guests on, Bill McConnell of Vertex and John Sebastian of Watt Teeter, to really give a general state of the construction industry, what we've learned over the past couple of years, and really what we see coming in the near future.
So why don't we just get into it? Let's get with these guests, these really great guests who took the time to be here with us today, and let's talk about the state of the construction industry. Welcome in. Bill McConnell is a co-founder and CEO of the Vertex companies, an AEC firm with over 650 employees throughout the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Bill is a top expert witness for large and complex domestic and international construction disputes, who's testified over 170 times related to scheduling, productivity, standard of care, and damages. He's also a frequent presenter at many construction, engineering, and law events. And for the past 16 years, Bill has prepared an annual State of the Construction Industry report that evaluates the construction industry in the context of the overall economy and historical trends.
John Sebastian is the managing partner of Watt Teeter's Chicago office. Watt Teeter is one of the nation's leading boutique construction law firms. He has over 20 years of experience in law and concentrates his practice in the areas of construction and surety law and commercial litigation. We really believe that these 2 guests, Bill and John, based on their knowledge and breadth of experience, can provide a lot of insight for our listeners. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So obviously, the pandemic and the economy are on the minds of many construction professionals and executives. Since the beginning of the year, construction indicators such as CFMA's Confindex number and AIA's Architectural Billings Index have been on an uptick. A little background on the Confindex number. This is a confidence index survey of construction financial management professionals, where a reading less than 100 indicates pessimism and greater than 100 indicates optimism. The survey has jumped from 87 in September 2020 to 93 in December 2020,
105 in March 2021, and up to 115 in June 2021. Bill, what do you think is giving construction professionals optimism regarding the industry?
Several things, Jeff. We've gone through a recession and a second year where we've still been impacted by the pandemic. However, the construction industry was deemed essential, and it was up 5% last year. It's up north of 5% this year. Half of the industry, which is residential, is having its greatest 2 years ever on record. It's up approximately 25 to 30% this year and was up something like 20% last year. So half of the industry right out of the gate is having an amazing year. The other half, which is lagged, actually has optimism as well. Non-residential work, which means predominantly public construction and commercial office, commercial retail, and industrial construction, etc. That's in the planning phase, like you mentioned, with the ABI, the Dodge Index, and other indices are showing that the planning for this work is going through the roof. So even though the numbers have lagged of late, people see a bright light at the end of the tunnel, and they see a lot of optimism being pent up for 2022, not to mention the fact that we have an infrastructure bill that's passed through the Senate, and they're looking to have it passed within the next 2 weeks. We'll see if that happens, but regardless, that's additional liquidity that's going to be forced into the public construction, well-needed liquidity that'll be forced into the public construction sector. So there's already optimism in the half of the industry, which is running at a record pace. And the other half, good news is abound. So that's why we're seeing the optimism, Jeff.
But do you think there's any economic indicators that are a cause for concern in construction or just the overall economy? Things that, are we in for another recession? Are we in for a dip, or are we, smooth sailing from here?
Well, when you look at the economic cycles in the 90s and 2010s, they were both nearly 10-year runs, with the last one being over 10 years, really being a bear market forever, longest on record. We had multi-year early cycle, mid-cycle, and late cycle. Late cycles where there was clearly no inflation, early cycle in the early 2010s, and then momentum built up in 2015. There was a lot of work, yet inflation really didn't hit until 2019, and then we entered a late cycle. Well, what we have here is more like an early 80s type of situation, or should I say maybe early 2000s, where you had a cycle that was 5 years, not 10 years. And in the early 80s, it was less than that. So we've come out of the shortest recession ever, which was 60 to 90 days. And all of a sudden, we have massive inflation and a shortage of workers. Usually in early cycle, there's plenty of resources available to build things. But now the industry's number one complaint, both engineering and construction, is workforce shortage. And that's really a mid-cycle to late cycle phenomenon where we have inflation plus low workers. And that's so we find ourselves kind of, I would say, mid-cycle at this point, which is unusual for just coming out of a recession 12 months ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess in terms of, what contractors and subcontractors should be doing, from an operations perspective with, those trends in mind, what kind of advice would you give to those subcontractors or contractors to, I guess, adapt to these changing times?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time when the pandemic first hit all of us reviewing everybody's contracts. And now I think everybody's used to taking a look at your time extension delay clause, your changes claims provision, price escalation, as that later became a big issue, suspension of work, termination convenience if you want to try to get out of it. And then, of course, where it all stems from is the force majeure clause. The transition is now, what do you do for new contracts? Address the pandemic head on in your contract. It seems like every owner and general contractor to subcontract has a provision that deals with the pandemic, and all it provides for is a time extension. So you got to really be cognizant. You may feel good about, oh, they're addressing the pandemic. Well, they're addressing it to keep you from getting additional costs. So you'd want to review that provision and make sure there's an avenue for you to get not just a time extension, but costs. So some creative ways of dealing with that is they may not allow you to deal with existing COVID issues, but unknown COVID issues. And that may provide an avenue for you to negotiate into the contract. Well, yes, we're all dealing with lumber shortage, or we're all dealing with productivity slowdowns tied to whatever additional testing you have to do at the site, whatever the case may be. But I want excluded, and I want costs potentially for anything that I'm not dealing with currently. So that's some of the tips we give to our general contractor or subcontractor clients. Alternatively, if you're dealing with a contractor negotiating a GMP contract with an owner, and we do have one owner we represent, it's negotiating the allowances to deal with the price escalation issues and making sure either you're treating them fairly and you have essentially a not to exceed number, or you try to get a firm bid or buy out material now for that project. Those are some suggestions that we've been trying to give our clients as it relates to COVID issues and dealing with the unknowns.
Now, John, again, I know, generally litigation takes a long time, but have we seen any sort of push towards, alternative dispute resolution prior to getting to litigation as it relates to these pandemic issues? Again, I haven't seen too much case law on it. And again, I'm not sure if you're aware of any. Have you seen any decisions so far, that relate to these COVID issues, or do you think we're going to see those kind of come in the horizon here in the next, probably 6 months to a year?
Well, Bill and I had talked about this kind of, we think early negotiations are helpful. Virtual, there are challenges, but can be overcome, and I'll get to that in a minute. We were brainstorming what would be the ideal way to deal with project issues, and it would be to have some sort of DRB identified and agreed to ahead of the project and put in the contract documents, and like the initial decision maker of the architect, but formally appoint either a 1 or a 3-person panel that decides all issues throughout the project, so you don't get to the end of the project and have litigation. Litigation never results in any party being happy because of the fees that they have to spend and taking time away from doing what they're good at, and that's building the project.
Yeah, I think it's also just kind of important to note that a lot of from the legal aspect, a lot of this case law, relating to the force majeure clauses, it's really all. I mean, I don't want to set specifics, but generally the case law is all from 1945 or prior. So there's really not a whole lot of recent case law out there as to how these disputes are related to a pandemic or unanticipated or unforeseen issues, causing a delay or whatever in a contract or in a project, operates. So from there, Jeff, do you have any follow-ups on this?
Let's get some of Bill's thoughts on those questions that we kind of went over with John, and what we're seeing in terms of types of claims or uptick in certain types of disputes, or how even things have kind of been changing in this ongoing / post-pandemic world.
I think John made a great point in terms of identifying your DRB or your mediator up front. And we were also talking about possibly even scheduling meetings through the pre-planned meetings through the course of the project in order to settle disputes, because you know there will be disputes. And if nothing less, it's just nice to kick in or get input from someone that's objective. The other thing that I was thinking about in terms of where we are, we all know there's quality issues and schedule risk when you get to these late cycle, mid to late cycle, where you have escalation and you have a shortage of workers, and you have buyout or margin fade because of escalation. So buying projects out early, very, very early in a project is really key. Some contract forms allow for that, some don't. If it's a CM at risk and the design phase is going to continue on for some time, a lot of the subs have another bite of the apple, which is good for them, not so good for a general contractor or potentially an owner. But whatever the contract form may be, doing a buyout as soon as humanly possible and watching quality like a hawk, because the workforce isn't as skilled as it was at one point in time, and really watching schedule and putting together your TIAs or whatever forensic analysis you choose quickly is more important than ever for contractors.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea, kind of meeting collectively, either, with ownership or with a designated dispute resolution board or mediator on a recurring basis. That could be pretty interesting, especially making sure that you're not accruing even just direct cost impacts over a certain amount of time. But I think over the past year, I've really seen a big uptick in inefficiency claims and cumulative impact claims. So I think, to your point, quality control and but even more so documentation of these kind of issues, and ensuring from the legal side, ensuring that you're not waiving the possibility of a cumulative impact claim or productivity claim as you are maybe resolving these individual issues.
And notice on those types of claims are very difficult, right? When to notice them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we hit on it earlier, right? All the surveys that come out from AGC, from Procore, from other organizations and companies that are taking metrics and surveys of construction professionals, labor shortage is always the biggest challenge to cope with. And we have this industry where we've had very little gains in labor efficiency over the past 100 years. What do you think contractors need to be doing and subcontractors need to be doing from an operations perspective, knowing that the labor market may be limited and they may be impacted by all these various productivity factors?
From my perspective, I see that subcontractors need to be more disciplined than ever in choosing work. The work is available, but can you manage the work with the amount of resources? And in some of the relets that we've done of late for the surety industry, we are seeing that discipline actually at the general contractor level, specifically with larger kind of multifamily builders. But on the subcontractor level, you can really get in trouble if you take on too much work and there's just no way to do it with the amount of resources that you have access to.
Great. Building off of what Bill said in response to the last question, what we believe is we're going to see more claims and litigation tied to or contractor defaults. Private contractors that were purely private works trying to get into the public works sector of construction. Now, obviously, when a contractor tries to get into a new field, there's risks. what we think the risks are as it relates to transitioning from private to public is, first of all, being able to bid on that type of work requires having a bonding line and estimating for all the prevailing wage and MBE requirements. In addition, you have to deal with the labor burden for prevailing wage, all the additional paperwork that comes with a public works type of contract. And then the biggest issue that private contractors dealing with trusted partners most of the time aren't used to is slow pay. So essentially on public works projects, you need to finance 1 to 2 to even 3 payment applications before you're actually being caught up for work 30 to 90 days prior. So that's the biggest impact, and that a lot of these contractors that are going to go for this work need to realize and face. And unfortunately, I think we'll see a lot of these contractors get into it and either get out of it or go out of business.
To kind of go along with those changes that we've seen recently and what we anticipate, have there been any technology advances or any modifications over the past couple years that you think are really here to stay in the industry?
So the changes that we've seen in the litigation area and has affected construction as well is transition to virtual dispute resolution. Now, the challenges that everybody has been aware of and is facing is missing the nonverbal and physical cues, lower quality connections, and most importantly, empathy you're not able to convey. And believe it or not, there are studies that have shown how we communicate. Words only represent 7% of our communication. Body language is 55%. And tone and inflections is 38% of how we communicate. So what we've found as it relates to settlement negotiations, default meetings, and even mediations, the real key is planning. Not that it wasn't before, preparation and planning, but you really need to have several calls beforehand with either the other side or the mediator, having an agenda, working out the technical issues. And you really yourself need to print out your opening statement, work on everything that you would typically do. You can't take for granted because it's virtual. You need to plan, prep. It's so much more important. You need to, unfortunately, clarify and summarize more often than you would if you were in person. And the other thing that we've noticed on mediations, you definitely have to take breaks like you would if you were in person. Otherwise, you're going to end the mediation quickly because you've gotten either to your bottom line is too quickly or you've frustrated the other person. And final tip that what we've seen in the last year and a half is resist the urge to get right down to business, make small talk. So all the things that you would do if you were in person, you need to keep doing, but try to do it virtually. And what I focused on the very first tip was empathy. You have to reflect and be attuned to the other person's feelings. You'd pick that up if you were in person, but you got to try to do that verbally as well.
Yeah, that's pretty difficult, right? If you're got several different people in the Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares version of Zoom, and the tendency is to look and make sure that you're looking normal in the frame, and so that's really good advice, and sort of just overall awareness that you kind of have passively or when you're in person versus virtually. From the construction side, I think a lot of the stuff are more band-aids to for safety purposes than any kind of technology advances driven by or resulting from the pandemic. But I think that they're working on labor tracking and things like that came about from about the need to social distance, and I think that those could be interesting when it comes to productivity tracking and tracking manpower in a given area and how maybe overmanning or reassignment of manpower could have productivity impacts. So I think we're still, construction side is still lagging in terms of productivity tracking. But I think that that's, with how many productivity claims or allegations of productivity claims that are being made, that's, a huge area where contractors and subcontractors need to improve. Bill, do you have any thoughts or advice for how contractors can make sure that their field personnel are tracking adequately so that commercial issues don't become a reality?
Yes, obviously, the more tracking, the better. And as you mentioned, if there is potentially labor tracking technologies that are developing, that will certainly help prove entitlement for claims. A lot of the tech that we've seen talked about, whether it's modular construction, prefab construction, BIM technology, et cetera, whether or not those technologies have assisted in making the overall construction industry higher in productivity I'm not sure if we're seeing projects built faster and for less money. And I know the latter isn't true. There is contract forms plus these items that we've talked about in terms of compressing and overlapping schedules between design and construction. But when you think about what tech is going to do in terms of QA and in terms of recording conformance with the contract plans and specifications, it may work very well for contractors that can establish that their weather-resistant barrier was properly lapped, as was their flashing before they installed their windows, and put a brick veneer over those items. They can now develop programs to prove that. But on the other side of the coin, you may be having drones flying through projects in the middle of night to see if your studs are perfectly 16 inches on center. And if they're not, there may be non-compliance reports that get kicked out on a daily basis. So it should be interesting to see what happens this decade. I see the applications definitely in terms of QA being applied very quickly over the next year or two.
Great. So kind of along with that, we'll try to wrap it up here. What is, this question is for both of you, what is one piece of advice that you'd give to contractors, moving forward over the next 5 years?
The same advice that has really come out since COVID has hit us all, and that is review your contracts. Make sure you're paying attention to the time extension, delay clauses, the changes, the claims, even so much more the price escalation and the unknown future as it relates to the supply chain issues. And making sure notice is provided as early as possible and often, and then future contracts, making sure that you're not just getting a time extension and that you can assert a claim for costs for the unknown. That would be I don't think anything's going to change as it relates to COVID for a couple years. So you really need to pay attention to your contracts more so than ever.
Yeah, and I echo that completely. I think if you're saying for me, the next couple years, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to see these supply chain issues persist. Inflation is here. Very often it doesn't go down. It usually takes a recession for inflation to settle, even though there's discussions about transitory inflation now. In resources, you don't see you don't see another million people jumping into the resource pool. So we have 7 million, not 6 million. So you're going to have to work with what you have, which means contractors need to be disciplined. And then if there is a recessionary cycle within that 5-year period, and that's also when contractors simply need to be disciplined in terms of right sizing and watching their CapEx and their overhead and their spending and their growth program. So it's an interesting time. It's a couple of the most interesting years we've ever gone through in construction in 20 and 21, and some disruption is taking place. So how that pans out moving forward should be very interesting.
That's great. And that's really why we have this podcast, is to provide these types of insights to, construction professionals, from the experts like yourselves, at Vertex, and from the legal perspective at Watt Teeter. So I believe that's all we have. We thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much for listening to our launch episode of the Building Up podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it.
If you have any topics you'd like to see featured on a future episode, please email us at buildinguppod@gmail.com.